In 1916, a French family ploughing a field near the River Somme pulled something small from the churned-up earth. It was a brown booklet, water-stained and pressed flat by months of soil, but the handwriting inside was still legible. It belonged to a British infantryman who had been buried in that ground since the previous summer. And tucked between the pages were a photograph of a woman, a lock of dark hair, and a handwritten will that fit on a single page. But the strangest part of this story is not what they found inside that booklet. It is that the British Army required every single soldier to carry it and to fill out that will before he ever walked into a trench. This is what was actually inside a World War I soldier's pockets, not the rifles and helmets you see in the movies. The small, personal, sometimes heartbreaking objects that tell you more about what this war was really like than any battle map ever could. The most important thing a British soldier carried in his pocket was not a weapon. It was a small brown booklet called the AB-64, and it went everywhere he went, into the trenches, into no man's land, into the mud and the rain and the gas. It sat in the top right breast pocket of his khaki tunic, and he was required to produce it on demand for any officer or regimental policeman who asked. Losing it was not an option. This was his identity, his military record, and, if things went badly, the only proof that he had ever existed at all. The AB-64 was officially called the Soldier's Service and Paybook. On its pages were his regimental number, his date of enlistment, the unit he belonged to, any awards or ranks he had earned, his skill at arms, his record of inoculations, and even a list of charges if he had been disciplined. His next of kin were written in there. His medical history was in there. Every course he had passed and every weapon he had trained on was recorded in those thin, water-prone pages. But it was also more than a military document. Soldiers used it the way you might use a wallet. Letters from home got folded up and slipped between the pages. Small photographs, the kind printed on postcard-sized paper, were tucked inside. Religious tokens, pressed flowers, even handwritten notes from sweethearts ended up crammed into the AB-64 because it was the one thing a soldier always had with him. Think about that for a second. The most personal object in his life, the photograph of his wife and children, lived inside a government-issued paybook because there was literally nowhere else safe to keep it. And the army knew this. That is exactly why the AB-64 became the primary way to identify a soldier who could no longer identify himself. When burial parties went out across the battlefields to recover the dead, the first thing they looked for was the paybook. If the face was gone, if the uniform was destroyed, if the body had been in the ground for weeks or months, the paybook was often the only thing that could put a name to what remained. The small brown booklet that a soldier cursed every time a regimental policeman asked to see it was, in the end, the thing that kept him from being buried as unknown. But there was one page in that booklet that soldiers dreaded more than any other. Page 13. That was the will. Every man who went to the front line for the first time was ordered to fill it out. The army even provided examples of how to begin writing it, right there on the page, because many of these men were 18, 19, 20 years old and had never thought about a will before in their lives. Now they were being told to sit down, probably in a staging area behind the lines, and decide what would happen to their belongings if they did not come back. Some men wrote a single sentence, leaving everything to their mothers. Others divided possessions between a wife and children they had barely spent time with. Some left the page blank, because filling it out felt like tempting fate, even though the army insisted. And some men who filled it out in pencil went back later and rewrote it in ink, as if making it more permanent was a way of accepting what was coming. The paybook had pockets built into the end boards, little internal flaps where additional papers could be stored. Soldiers slipped all kinds of things in there. A ticket stub from a music hall they had visited on leave, a pressed wildflower from a field in France, a scrap of fabric from a sweetheart's handkerchief. These were not items the army cared about. They had no military value, but they were the things that made a man feel like a person and not just a number on a casualty list. So the paybook was in the pocket. But it was not the only piece of identity on his body. Hanging around his neck, underneath his uniform and against his skin, were his identity discs. In 1914, when the war started, British soldiers were issued a single aluminum disc stamped with their name, regimental number, and religious denomination. The religion mattered because if a soldier died, it determined what kind of burial service he would receive. That single disc was supposed to be removed from the body and sent back to confirm the death. The problem was obvious almost immediately. Once the disc was removed, the body had no identification on it at all. And in a war where artillery could churn up the same ground over and over again, where bodies were buried and uncovered and buried again, that meant thousands of men became permanently unidentifiable. By September of 1916, the British Army had introduced a two-disc system to fix this. Each soldier now wore two fiber discs on cords around his neck. One was round and dyed red. The other was octagonal and dyed green. Both carried the same stamped information. The red disc was meant to be taken from the body to report the death. The green disc stayed with the remains, so the man could still be identified later, even if someone else found the body, weeks or months down the line. Soldiers had a dark saying about how to remember which was which. Red for blood, because it was taken when you were dead. Green for grass, because it stayed in the ground with you. That kind of humor was everywhere in the trenches. It was the only way to talk about things that were otherwise too heavy to say out loud. The discs themselves were made of vulcanized asbestos fiber, which sounds durable but was anything except that. Weeks of sweat, rain, and trench mud could soften them until the stamped letters became unreadable. In the worst cases, the fiber crumbled entirely, leaving nothing behind. And the problem compounded over time. A soldier who went into the trenches in October might have perfectly legible discs. By February, after months of damp wool against skin, after sleeping in flooded dugouts, after wading through shell craters filled with stagnant water, those same discs could be nearly blank. The fear of being buried as an unknown soldier was not abstract. Every man on the Western Front had seen unmarked graves. Every man knew what a blank disc meant for his family. Some soldiers recognized this problem and made their own identity bracelets out of scrap metal, or paid local jewelers behind the lines to engrave silver wristbands with their details. These bracelets became popular enough that comic postcard artists back in England started including them in cartoons about fashionable soldiers. They were never official issue. The army never asked for them. But soldiers knew, in a very practical way, that a piece of silver would survive longer in the ground than a fiber disc, and that was reason enough to spend the money. Now, underneath the right flap of the soldier's tunic, sewn into the fabric itself, was something he hoped he would never have to use. The first field dressing. This was a small packet, wrapped in waterproof material, containing 2 rolled bandages and a safety pin. One bandage was small, intended for the entry wound where a bullet or piece of shrapnel went in. The other was larger, meant for the exit wound, which was almost always worse. The packet was manufactured by companies like Coxon, Gerard and Company out of Birmingham, and it was printed with instructions from the War Office Medical Division on the outer cover. Every single British soldier on the front lines carried at least one. The reason it was sewn into a specific, standardized pocket is something that sounds simple, but was actually a matter of life and death. Standard doctrine said that when a soldier was wounded, you used his dressing, not your own. Because if you used yours on him, and then you got hit 10 minutes later, or had to treat someone else, you had nothing left. So every man in the unit needed to know exactly where every other man's dressing was kept. That is why the army put it in the same spot on every tunic, under the right flap every time. You did not search for it. You did not ask. You reached for it in the dark, under fire, with blood on your hands, and it was there. Some soldiers carried more than one, especially if they could scrounge extras from supply or take them from wounded men who had already been treated at a proper aid station. But the one sewn into the tunic was their personal allocation, and it was understood that using it was a last resort. The real medical care came from stretcher bearers and aid posts further behind the lines. The first field dressing was just meant to keep you alive long enough to reach them. For many soldiers, it was the only medical equipment they ever touched. And every man who wore a tunic with that small, hard lump under the right flap knew exactly what it was for. It was a constant physical reminder, pressing against the body with every step, that the army expected you to get hit. The question was never if, it was when. There was something else in those pockets that carried more emotional weight than almost anything the army issued. Letters. The British Army Postal Service delivered around 2 billion letters over the course of the war. By 1917, over 19,000 mailbags were crossing the English Channel every single day, carrying letters and parcels to British troops on the Western Front. At its peak, the system was handling 12 million pieces of mail per week. That is not a typo. 12 million. The army considered delivering mail to the front as important as delivering ammunition and rations, because it understood something about morale that is easy to forget. A man who has not heard from home in weeks starts to come apart in ways that have nothing to do with bullets. Soldiers wrote letters during any spare moment they could find, in rest areas behind the lines, in dugouts during quiet stretches, sometimes in the trenches themselves. The letters were subject to censorship, and soldiers were forbidden from mentioning locations, unit movements, or anything that could be useful to the enemy if the letter was intercepted. To get around this, some men invented codes. A common trick was placing tiny dots under specific letters in the text, so that reading only the dotted letters would spell out the name of a town or a position. One Canadian soldier was actually court-martialed for writing the word Vimy in a letter home. For soldiers who did not have time or energy to write a proper letter, the army provided field service cards. These were pre-printed postcards with a short list of statements that the soldier could cross out as appropriate. I am quite well. I have been admitted into hospital. I am being sent down to the base. I have received your letter. You crossed out the ones that did not apply and sent the rest. If you added anything else, any personal note at all, the card was destroyed by the censor. Soldiers hated them. They felt cold and impersonal, like filling out a government form instead of talking to the people you loved. But for families back in England, a field service card arriving in the Morning Post meant one very specific thing: he is still alive. And when the alternative was a telegram from the War Office beginning with the words, "It is my painful duty to inform you," sometimes that card, with its crossed-out lines, was the best thing a mother or wife could receive. The sheer volume of mail tells you something about how central writing was to a soldier's survival, not physically, but mentally. A man separated from his wife and children for months, sometimes years, had almost no other way to feel connected to the life he had left behind. Letters described births he missed, illnesses he could not help with, and small domestic details that he clung to because they proved the world was still normal somewhere. Some men wrote nearly every day. Others could not bring themselves to write at all because the act of composing a letter meant acknowledging how far away from home they really were. The letters themselves were often folded small enough to fit in a breast pocket alongside the paybook. Photographs came too. Pictures of wives, children, parents, and sweethearts printed on stiff cardstock, small enough to hold in one hand. Some soldiers kept them loose in a pocket. Others slid them between the pages of the paybook or the New Testament they carried. These photographs were handled so frequently that the edges wore smooth, the faces fading over time from the oils on a man's fingers. A photograph touched 1,000 times does not look the same as one kept in a drawer. You can tell, even a century later, which ones were carried and which ones were stored. If you looked inside a soldier's breast pocket alongside the paybook and the letters, you would almost certainly find cigarettes. Smoking in the trenches was not a casual habit, it was survival. Cigarettes masked the smell of decomposing bodies in the nearby earth. They calmed the hands during bombardments that could last for days. They gave a man something to do with the long, empty, terrified hours between attacks. The British military ration included tobacco, and parcels from home frequently contained cigarettes sent by wives, mothers, and even schoolchildren who organized collection drives. But the most famous cigarettes of the entire war came inside a small brass box sent at Christmas in 1914. Princess Mary, the 17-year-old daughter of King George V, wanted every sailor afloat and every soldier at the front to receive a personal Christmas gift. Her original plan was to pay for it from her own allowance, but the scale was too large, so a public fund was created instead. The response from the British public was enormous. By the time the fund closed in 1920, almost £200,000 had been raised, and more than 2.5 million boxes had been produced. The box itself was an ornate, embossed brass tin, about 5 inches long and 3 inches wide. Around its edges were stamped the names of the Allied powers: Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, and Japan. Princess Mary's silhouette and monogram sat in the center of the lid, with the words Christmas 1914 underneath. For smokers, the box contained 1 ounce of pipe tobacco, a packet of 20 cigarettes wrapped in distinctive yellow monogrammed paper, a pipe, and a tinder lighter. Non-smokers received acid tablet sweets, a khaki writing case, paper, and a pencil instead. Indian troops got sweets and spices. Nurses received chocolate. Every box, regardless of contents, included a Christmas card from Princess Mary and a photograph of her. Filling those boxes required 44,840 pounds of tobacco, over 700,000 pipes, and more than 13 million cigarettes. An estimated 335,000 boxes were delivered by Christmas Day itself, though brass shortages meant that some soldiers did not receive theirs until the summer of 1916. By January of 1919, the War Office reported that over 250,000 gifts were still undelivered and placed newspaper advertisements trying to find the remaining eligible soldiers. Many men kept the box long after the tobacco was smoked. It became a container for other small treasures: a wedding ring taken off before a patrol because hands swell in the cold, a coin from a French village, a button from a dead friend's uniform. The Princess Mary box outlived the war in thousands of homes across Britain, sitting on mantelpieces and dressers, repurposed as a sewing kit or a place to keep cufflinks, but always carrying the memory of where it came from. Now, alongside these official items, soldiers carried things the army never issued and never recorded: lucky charms. Superstition ran deep in the trenches, and it is not hard to understand why. When the difference between living and dying could come down to whether you ducked at the right second or took 2 steps to the left instead of the right, men reached for anything that felt like it offered control. A marble shamrock worn on a cord around the neck, a piece of coal sent from home as a token of luck, a rabbit's foot carried in a trouser pocket, a coin with a hole in it threaded onto a bootlace. The most popular lucky charm of the war was a tiny figure called a fumsup. It looked like a naked baby with its thumbs permanently raised, similar to the Kewpie dolls that were popular at the time. Fumsup dolls were mass-marketed as touchwood charms, meant to be held for luck, the physical version of knocking on wood. Soldiers bought them, their families sent them, and some men refused to go into the line without one. French children and soldiers' sweethearts made woolen dolls called Rin Tin Tin and Nanette, often in red, white, and blue yarn. The tradition held that the dolls only became lucky if they were given as a gift, not purchased. An American corporal named Lee Duncan found 2 puppies in an abandoned German kennel in France and named them after those dolls. Nanette did not survive, but Rin Tin Tin came home to California and became one of the most famous dogs in Hollywood history. That story started with a lucky charm in a trench. Religious texts were everywhere. The Active Service New Testament was a small, pocket-sized edition of the Bible specifically designed for soldiers in the British Armed Forces. It was distributed widely, and troops were encouraged to carry it at all times. For many, it served a dual purpose: spiritual comfort on one hand, and on the other, the quiet hope that a thick enough booklet in a breast pocket might slow down a bullet or a piece of shrapnel. That was not just wishful thinking. The Imperial War Museum holds a Bible that is believed to have been in the left breast pocket of gunner John Dickinson when he was hit in 1915. The book stopped the fragment. He survived. Similar stories circulated throughout the war, and each one made the next man more likely to keep his testament close to his heart. Whether it was faith or physics, The result was the same. The book stayed in the pocket. There was one more item that many soldiers carried that would change civilian life forever after the war ended: the wristwatch. Before 1914, real men did not wear watches on their wrists. That was considered a woman's accessory. Men carried pocket watches, tucked into waistcoat pockets and attached with chains. But in the cramped, muddy, desperate reality of trench warfare, pulling a pocket watch out of your clothing, opening the case, checking the time, and putting it back was not just inconvenient. It could get you killed. Officers needed to synchronize attacks down to the second. Artillery barrages had to lift at precise moments. Timing a charge wrong by even 60 seconds could mean walking into your own shells. So officers began strapping pocket watches to their wrists with leather holders called wristlets. And by 1915, companies like Omega, Longines, and Rolex were producing purpose-built trench watches with luminous radium-painted dials that could be read in the dark and shatterproof crystals that could survive the conditions. When soldiers came home after the war, they kept wearing their watches on their wrists. Within a decade, the pocket watch was nearly obsolete. Every time you glance at your wrist to check the time, you are repeating a habit that started in a trench in France. And then there were the things soldiers made themselves. Trench art. In the long stretches between combat, men with metalworking skills or just restless hands turned the debris of war into objects of surprising beauty. Bullet casings were hammered and engraved into vases and letter openers. Shell casings became decorative containers etched with names, dates, and regimental crests. Coins were shaped into rings. Pieces of shrapnel were polished and mounted as paperweights. One soldier's notebook was recently discovered filled with pressed wildflowers, each one sealed between the pages with a drop of wax. Messages signed "From Bert" were written alongside them. Nobody knows who Bert was making it for. A sweetheart back in England, a mother, maybe just himself, preserving something beautiful in a place where beauty was hard to find. Soldiers also scavenged from no man's land during quiet periods or after attacks. Watches from the bodies of fallen enemy soldiers, razors, knives. Photographs of German families that looked exactly like photographs of British families, men standing stiffly beside wives and children in a studio somewhere in Bavaria or Saxony. Buttons and badges from opposing regiments kept the way a collector might keep rare coins. Some of these items were kept as trophies, proof that you had been there, that you had survived something. Others were kept because they were the only evidence that the man lying face down in the crater had been a person, too, and not just a shape in a uniform. Soldiers could only keep what they could carry in their kit, so they were selective about what mattered enough to weigh them down. And officers, who had more access to storage and could send packages home, often bought souvenirs from French shops behind the lines or from other soldiers who had more trophies than pocket space. When a soldier died, a process began that almost nobody talks about today. His personal effects were collected, catalogued, and eventually sent home to his next of kin. The paybook, the identity discs, or whatever remained of them, letters, photographs, the watch, if it survived, whatever was in his pockets when the burial party reached him. These items arrived in parcels and envelopes, sometimes months after the telegram that announced the death, and families opened them, knowing that these were the last objects their son or husband or father had touched. Private Edward Ambrose from Hertfordshire was just 18 years old when he died at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. His belongings were sent back to his mother. She locked them in a suitcase, put the suitcase in the attic, and never opened it again. Nearly 100 years later, the suitcase was found. Inside were the small, ordinary, devastating objects of a young man who never came home. A curator at the Hertz at War project called the collection a snapshot of a young man's life. Not a soldier's life, a young man's life. Lance Sergeant Charles Stevens from Cambridge was in the 11th Suffolks when he died at the Battle of Arras in 1917. His body was not found until decades later, when construction disturbed the ground near Rouen in France. The French family who discovered the remains found a pocket watch, buttons, and a flask in its leather casing still with the body. They identified him by the regiment number stamped on a spoon. Then they spent years tracking down his living relatives, eventually finding his grandson, who traveled to France to collect his grandfather's belongings. Objects that had been underground for 75 years returned to a family that had never stopped wondering what happened to him. That is what was inside a World War I soldier's pockets. A paybook with a will written in pencil, 2 fiber discs that were supposed to keep him from being forgotten, a bandage sewn into his coat for the wound he hoped would never come, letters from a wife who wrote every day, cigarettes that made the smell bearable, a brass box from a teenage princess, a charm that was supposed to keep him safe, a watch that changed how the world tells time, and a photograph, handled so many times that the face in it was nearly worn away, of someone who was waiting for him to come home. None of these things won the war. None of them appear in the official histories or the strategic summaries written by generals after the armistice. But they are the truest record we have of what it meant to be there. They are the things a man chose to keep close when he had almost nothing, and the things that came back in a brown paper envelope when he did not. Every museum that displays them is really displaying the same thing, not objects, evidence that someone was here and someone was waiting. If this video taught you something you did not know, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which item surprised you the most. And if you have not already, tap that like button so more people can find this story.